Jane Fonda, just the mention of her name, was enough to make an entire era of cinema blaze with beauty, rebellion, and extraordinary talent. Yet behind those fiery eyes that once burned through the silver screen, behind that steel figure and indomitable spirit, was a girl consumed by shadows far more brutal than any role she ever portrayed. The devastating loss of her mother, the cold silence of a distant father, and wounds that never truly healed. She left the world in awe in Klute, thundered with defiance in Coming Home, and ignited an entire generation with her workout tapes, but behind that dazzling glow were endless nights of torment, hidden battles, tragedies no spotlight could ever reach. And just when people believed the storm had passed, that peace had finally returned, her later years brought a merciless trial that left fans stunned. What is it that truly haunts the woman America both idolized and condemned? Before we uncover the cruel truth, leave a like as a tribute to the extraordinary strength of Jane Fonda, a symbol who has lived, endured, scarred, yet unbroken, still standing proud against the storm. The legend was forged not only on stage, but in the lonely corners of a home where love felt distant and pain arrived far too soon. Born on December 23, 1937, she entered a world dazzled by Hollywood's glow, yet her own house was marked not by warmth, but by silence. Her father, Henry Fonda, revered by millions as one of American cinema's towering figures, stood like a monument. Admired, untouchable, yet heartbreakingly distant to his daughter. Praise was rare, embraces absent, and the few gestures of attention came sharpened as criticism. She learned cruelly, at an age too young, that if she was not flawless, slim enough, composed enough, she might never be worthy of his gaze. Then in 1945, at just 12 years old, came the wound that shattered her innocence. Her mother was gone. The family offered only a cold excuse, heart failure, and then erased her presence entirely. Photos vanished. Her name was hushed. It was as if she had never lived, but the truth came in the cruelest way. At school, flipping through a magazine, Jane read a single sentence that cut like a blade. Her mother had taken her own life. The revelation was tragic. It was merciless. It was more than a child could bear. She was denied mourning, forced to carry the weight alone. The night before, she hadn't gone downstairs to say goodnight, and in the haunted mind of a grieving child, that omission became a curse. Regret clung to her, guilt pressed like a stone, and for years she believed, quietly, irrationally, that it had been her fault, that maybe if she had whispered goodbye, her mother might have stayed. Decades later, she would admit that guilt never truly left her, that even at the height of her fame, the shadow of that night still followed her. Her father gave no explanation, no comfort. He simply marched forward as if nothing had happened, and Jane, still barely a teenager, was expected to do the same. Outwardly, she complied, but inside, the fracture deepened. She built a shell of discipline and perfectionism to contain the sorrow that never left her, trading tenderness for poise, masking grief with control. She stopped reaching for affection. She stopped expecting answers. She hardened, grew quieter, driven yet hollow. The opposite of the tender child she had once been. That absence of comfort defined her adolescence. She did not rebel. She performed. She did not cry. She endured. And when the world later celebrated her beauty, her brilliance, her unforgettable roles, they never saw the invisible thread binding it all, a relentless, aching hunger to be worthy of love. Jane Fonda did not ascend to fame by luck. She rose because she had no choice. Because the silence of her childhood carved a merciless truth into her soul. Unless she made herself exceptional, she risked vanishing altogether, just like her mother. In the blinding glare of 1960s Hollywood, where flawlessness wasn't requested but enforced, a young Jane Fonda was quietly unraveling behind a mask of perfection. In her early 20s, her face adorned magazine covers, her name lit marquees, yet inside she was a battlefield of shame and silence. The daughter of Henry Fonda, Hollywood royalty, she grew up in velvet rooms shadowed by cold expectations and never once felt truly seen. Her father, adored on screen, was absent at home. Praise was rare, affection rarer still. When his eyes found her, they carried critique, not comfort. If she wasn't thin enough, polished enough, flawless enough, she feared she would vanish. That belief calcified with fame. By the time the world adored her, Jane despised herself. Behind every red carpet smile was a war she was losing daily. She fought bulimia in silence, binging and purging in punishing cycles hidden beneath gowns and posters. Nobody knew. How could they? To the world, she looked like everything they wanted. But Jane could not even meet her own eyes in the mirror. Years later, she would confess that she loathed her body and believed if she could fix it, maybe the rest of her might hurt less. Hollywood only deepened the wound. Executives, blinded by fantasy, offered cruelty as advice. One even suggested breaking her jaw, removing molars, to slim her face for the camera. It wasn't satire, it was Hollywood logic. And Jane, still desperate for approval, obeyed. She went under the knife, not out of vanity, but despair. The procedures were agony masked as beauty. Every cut was pain she paid to endure, every stitch a reminder that Hollywood demanded blood as its currency. She endured the blade in silence, hoping the physical torment would erase the deeper agony inside. Each alteration was a plea for worth, each scar a monument to doubt. Yet the mirror was never satisfied. However flawless she looked, the girl within remained bruised. Her 20s, an age the world romanticized, were hollow years for Jane, carved out by shame, loneliness, and the crushing act of pretending to be fine. She was elegance on screen, fearlessness in photographs. But inside, she was certain she would not live past 30. That is how deep the pain ran. What the world saw was a star ascending. What they missed was the collapse just beyond the frame. Behind the polished image of Jane Fonda stood a young woman at war with herself, shattered by the endless hunger to be loved, hollowed by an industry that only valued the surface. And though the decades ahead would bring resilience, reinvention, and fierce advocacy, the scars from that crucible of youth never truly faded. They lived beneath her skin, reminders etched by both scalpel and sorrow, proof that no spotlight could ever banish the shadows she carried within. By the late 1960s, Jane Fonda was no longer just Henry Fonda's daughter. At 30, she had become a force all her own, unyielding, intelligent, and unwilling to bow to an industry that once tried to silence her. Her true breakthrough wasn't wrapped in glamour, but forged in grit. In 1969's They Shoot Horses, Don't They? She embodied a desperate dancer crushed under the weight of the Great Depression. It wasn't simply acting, it was anguish made flesh, the cry of someone clinging to life by a thread. 2 years later, at 33, Klute gave her another chance to bleed truth on screen. What could have been a shallow cliché became, in her hands, a searing portrait of a woman clawing for identity in a world that reduced her to an object. The Academy took notice. Her first Oscar wasn't a crown of glory, it was proof of rebirth. By 1978, in Coming Home, Jane delivered one of the most devastating and transformative roles of her life. A woman forever changed by caring for a paralyzed Vietnam veteran. The tears were not staged, the empathy was lived. And with that second Oscar, Jane's path shifted yet again. She no longer acted to impress, she acted to matter. Years later, she confessed that only when the scripts carried truth did she feel whole, and that every role without it left her hollow. But Jane's fight didn't end with the cameras. Frustrated by shallow roles and Hollywood's profit-first machine, she dared what few women of the 1970s would. She co-founded her own production company, risky, even reckless, but it gave her what she had long been denied: control. And with that came the freedom to tell stories of war, healing, justice, feminism. Not for applause, but accountability. Coming Home didn't just move audiences, it pushed an entire nation to confront its scars from Vietnam. Jane believed films were never mere escape. They were revelations. She refused to betray that belief, even when it cost her roles, money, or public favor. In an industry addicted to image, Jane demanded substance. She once reflected that every time she stood on stage with an Oscar, she felt not triumph, but responsibility, to use her voice for those who had none. From Oscar podiums to anti-war rallies, from studio sets to congressional hearings, she redefined what it meant to be a star. Her performances became mirrors. Her career, a mission. And her legacy, built not on convenience, but on conviction, stands as rare testimony to courage in a world that worships comfort. Jane Fonda didn't simply act. She answered to a calling higher than fame. And in doing so, she forever changed what a woman in Hollywood could be. There are moments in life with no return. Turning points so sharp, they carve a soul forever. For Jane Fonda, that moment came not beneath Hollywood lights, but in a distant land far from home. By the early 1970s, in her mid-30s, she was evolving beyond the image the screen had stamped on her. After years of wrestling with self-worth and relentless pressure, she sought something larger: purpose. Listening to the stories of students, families, and veterans scarred by conflict, Jane felt drawn to witness pain where it lived, not just where it was reported. In 1972, she traveled abroad to see the war's human cost. Visiting hospitals, schools, and communities weighed down by years of loss. The resilience she encountered humbled her. Faces marked by grief still shone with grace. She listened. She asked questions. She tried to understand suffering stripped of headlines. But then came a single photograph, a brief, awkward moment captured near military equipment. To her, it was nothing. To the world back home, it was everything. Circulating fast, the image ignited outrage. Headlines branded her Hanoi Jane. Boycotts followed. Film offers dwindled. What she meant as compassion became framed as betrayal. The backlash cut deep, leaving her career, her name, even her intentions scarred. Later, Jane would speak with candor. She regretted the photograph, not the journey, not the listening, but the way the image wounded those already grieving. It had never been meant to offend, yet she understood its emotional weight, and she owned that truth with humility. The easy path would have been silence. Jane chose healing. She turned pain into art, empathy into purpose. In 1978, at 40, she produced and starred in Coming Home, a film that carried the voices of veterans long ignored. The performance, raw and reverent, earned her another Academy Award. But more than an honor, it was atonement, a tribute born of listening. Though the controversy lingered for years, it did not harden her. She once reflected that compassion mattered more than approval. because applause fades, but conscience remains. What the world called scandal became, for Jane, a crucible. She learned that one photograph could reshape a reputation, but not erase a lifetime of truth. Out of the silence, she found strength untethered from validation and a voice that spoke louder in service of empathy. That chapter was not an end, but a redefinition, proof that conviction can survive condemnation, and that even in misunderstanding, a life built on purpose cannot be undone. One might imagine that after surviving public condemnation and private demons, Jane Fonda would finally find peace. But the deepest battles of her life were only beginning. Over the years, she would pass through 3 marriages, each peeling back new layers of vulnerability, longing, and the aching hunger for love without conditions. None of them, however dazzling in public, left her feeling whole. The first began in 1965, when at just 27, she married French director Roger Vadim. He was nearly a decade older, already infamous for his affairs with legendary actresses, and he pulled Jane further into the burning glare of celebrity. To him, she was a muse, waiting to be unveiled, a canvas of sensuality not yet explored. Under his gaze, she transformed, half terrified, half compelled, into an icon she barely recognized. Their collaboration in Barbarella in 1968 turned her into a global emblem of allure. But the brighter the spotlight, the deeper the shadows grew behind closed doors. That same year, when their daughter Vanessa was born, Jane entered motherhood with trembling hope, only to find herself split between 2 selves she could never reconcile: the public figure demanded by Hollywood and the private nurturer her heart longed to be. She wanted both, yet believed she was failing at each. Vadim pressed her into roles that flaunted her body, while Jane craved characters with depth, pain, and truth. The conflict widened the rift between them. And then came the guilt, the kind that haunts a mother's soul. Years later, Jane admitted that in Vanessa's childhood, she felt like a photograph, visible in images, but absent in real life. At the very height of her beauty and fame, she felt emotionally hollow, trapped in a performance she no longer wanted to give. In a rare reflection, she confessed that she would look at herself in the mirror and wonder, am I living this life, or just rehearsing it for someone else? Their marriage cracked as ambition drove them apart, Vadim chasing spectacle, Jane searching for meaning. In 1973, at 35, she walked away, not only from a husband, but from a version of herself that had never truly been seen. She carried Vanessa with her, choosing pain over pretense, honesty over illusion. Yet freedom came wrapped in torment. Motherhood had not silenced her doubts. It had amplified them. She felt courageous, but fractured, liberated, yet unworthy. For all the applause, all the magazine covers, Jane Fonda was still, at her core, a woman reaching for love that did not demand conditions. Leaving Vadim was not a conclusion. It was the first step in a lifelong struggle toward becoming whole. Hardly had Jane broken free from the image carved by Vadim when she entered another chapter, this time beside a man defined not by movie sets but by protest lines: Tom Hayden. To the world, his name blazed with political fire. To Jane, at 35, scarred by loss and still bleeding from silence, he seemed less a romance than redemption. He was not only a partner, but a cause, an ideology she could cling to when fame felt hollow. Yet almost immediately, she discovered the quiet war inside herself, the public revolutionary against the private mother. In 1973, when her son Troy was born, she prayed motherhood would steady her, Instead, it tore her further apart. Tom imagined a wife who could drive his campaigns while keeping a flawless home. Jane tried, she marched, she fundraised, she rocked her baby to sleep, but nothing was enough. Years later, she admitted with aching honesty, "I didn't know how to be a mother." Love for her had always come with conditions, and even parenting became another merciless performance. She sacrificed nights for meetings, then raced home, desperate to recover missed story times, but guilt followed like a shadow she could not outrun. She longed to be both, unyielding on the front lines, tender in the nursery, but that woman existed only in fantasy. Behind their shared causes, fissures widened. Jane began to sense that Tom, despite their ideals, saw her more as a symbol than an equal. Together, they launched non-profits, championed change, but in private, she felt like a silhouette of herself. The old distance she once endured with her father returned, now in the form of a marriage that demanded strength, but rarely offered solace. And the cruelest echo was this. The same absence she had once suffered as a daughter, she now feared her own son was enduring. Her bond with Troy carried the weight. There were mornings she wasn't there, tears she couldn't soothe, moments she could never reclaim. Her activism gave voice to the voiceless, yet her own child often grew up in the echo of her absence. By 1990, when the marriage ended, Jane had become a cultural force, but at a staggering cost. "I love my children," she confessed, "but I was never sure I was enough for them." Looking back, she did not regret the battles she fought for justice, but she mourned the emotional terrain she had never learned to cross. The woman who inspired millions often struggled to offer compassion to herself. Her marriage to Tom Hayden was not simply a love story. It was a reckoning, where public conviction collided with private sacrifice, where victories on the streets were paid for in silence at home. And when the crowds finally dispersed, Jane stood alone with the hardest task of all, to forgive herself and to believe, at last, that even in her imperfection, she was worthy of love. By 1991, at 53, Jane Fonda was no longer the fragile daughter, haunted by legacy, or the firebrand activist marching on protest lines. She was seasoned, scarred, wiser, and weary of beginning again. Then came Ted Turner, the flamboyant media titan behind CNN, a man of jets, ranches, and empires. To the world, he seemed to offer her everything: security, stability, and a kingdom of plenty. To Jane, still aching from years of inner wars, he appeared to offer the one thing she had always chased and never found: belonging. At first, the dream glittered. They glided through galas as a flawless power couple, divided their time between sprawling estates, and played their parts for the cameras. Yet beneath chandeliers and manicured lawns, a quieter truth stirred. It was not neglect, as in her childhood, but invisibility. Roger had wanted her as muse, Tom as comrade, and Ted wanted a partner who fit the frame, not one who fractured it. Her opinions were tolerated, rarely sought. The woman once forged in fire, outspoken and unafraid, began to blur beneath polished appearances. Publicly, she stood beside a titan. Privately, she began to vanish. Her children were grown. The chaos slowed, yet Jane drifted, not silenced by others, but muted by roles she kept performing. She became what the world applauded: poised, gracious, devoted. But behind closed doors, she longed for the self that was messy, passionate, ablaze with conviction. Years later, she would confess the marriage was a place of gentle love, but absent of heat. No cruelty undid them, only erosion. Even comfort, she realized, can harden into a cage. And though there were no children born of this union, the loneliness was its own inheritance. By 2001, at 63, she found the courage to walk away, not with courtroom battles or public scandal, but with a quiet decision that luxury was too small a trade for freedom. Yes, she left with wealth, estates, security, a fortune that could last lifetimes. But the truest treasure was sovereignty. For the first time in decades, Jane did not belong to a man, a movement, or a mold. She belonged to herself. And after half a lifetime of searching, perhaps that was the boldest love story she ever dared to live. Across 3 marriages and countless reinventions, Jane Fonda's role as a mother remained one of her most complex scripts, stitched with devotion, guilt, and an unending search for redemption. In 1968, at 30, she cradled her first daughter Vanessa, later calling her brave, and remembered the moment as nothing short of transcendence. Yet raising a child beneath Hollywood's glare filled her with remorse. She feared passing down the perfectionism that had scarred her own youth, even as she struggled to shield Vanessa from it while stumbling through motherhood herself. With Troy, born in 1973, when Jane was 35, the story deepened. She admired his steadiness and creative fire, but guilt shadowed her. Missed meals, broken promises, projects that pulled her away. She later confessed she had to learn to apologize with my whole heart, not only for her mistakes, but for the choices that cost her time with him. Healing came slowly, through honesty, shared pain, and the fragile courage of forgiveness. Motherhood did not leave Jane empty. It remade her. When she founded a youth program in Georgia, it was not just philanthropy, but penance, born of knowing what it felt like to be lost and what her children had taught her about humility. Vanessa and Troy gave her more than roles to play. They gave her the grace to be imperfect and the will to keep trying. Her story was never about flawless parenting or fairy tale marriages. It was about persistence, about loving and being loved in broken, unfinished ways. Every parting left scars, but also space for growth. And the woman Jane became, wiser, more whole, quietly fierce, emerged not in spite of her wounds, but because of them. In the end, her greatest legacy may not rest in Oscars or protests, but in the hearts of her children. A legacy of resilience, tenderness, and the courage to keep becoming.
You know, I'm not scared of dying. What I'm really scared of is getting to the end of life with a lot of regrets.
Even after weathering the storms of marriage, motherhood, and fame, Jane Fonda's most merciless battle came not from scandal or heartbreak, but from the betrayal of her own body. By the time she entered her 70s, her name was already carved into history, yet her flesh whispered of mortality. In 2010, at 72, doctors delivered the verdict: breast cancer. A lumpectomy removed the immediate threat, but no scalpel could cut out the fear. The scars faded, but every checkup rekindled dread. Every night carried the quiet terror that another blow might come. 9 years later, in 2019 at 81, a small lesion on her lip brought the word cancer back again. The treatment was minor, but the message was brutal. Time was no longer infinite. And then, in 2022, at 84, came the heaviest strike of all: non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. When many at that age surrender quietly to decline, Jane stepped into chemotherapy with the same candor that had once shaken Hollywood. She went public, hoping her honesty might comfort others walking the same dark corridors. Yet beneath the courage was the private truth: suffering that arrives without cameras or applause. Sterile hospital rooms, the drip of IV lines, the cold hum of machines, nights when the only company was silence and the weight of her own thoughts. She would later admit that cancer slowed her down and forced her to confront what she feared most. Not dying, but dying with regrets. And regrets she carried like stones: birthdays missed, goodbyes cut short, calls never made, because work and causes always came first. That guilt did not vanish with remission. It lingered like a shadow she carried into every dawn. Even as treatments worked, Jane faced what all humans dread: the slow betrayal of time. Her knees throbbed, her spine bent, her once formidable memory flickered. For the woman who once embodied strength, accepting frailty became her hardest role. And perhaps the cruelest part was the solitude. After 3 failed marriages, no partner by her side, and grown children living their own lives, Jane met her darkest hours, largely alone. Not unloved, but often unseen. She had wealth, she had legacy, but in the stillness of night, none of it held her hand. She remembered lying awake, whispering to herself that persistence, not perfection, was her truest survival. Her battle demanded no red carpets, no speeches, only breath, only resolve. When she finally emerged from treatment, thinner, slower, but smiling, she offered the world a new kind of beauty. Not the fleeting glow of youth, not flawless skin, but the enduring grace of persistence, of rising each morning when the body begged to stop. Jane Fonda had built an empire of art, activism, and acclaim. But in her quiet war with illness, she revealed the rawest truth of her legacy, not only in what she accomplished, but in how fiercely she endured. And that endurance, more than the Oscars, more than fortune, became the ultimate proof that her life, scarred and shadowed as it was, had been lived fully, defiantly, and without surrender. At 87, Jane Fonda no longer seeks the spotlight. She lives in the quiet glow of hard-earned serenity. Her Los Angeles home, once a backdrop for interviews and glittering galas, has become a sanctuary of trees, books, and silence, where the walls no longer echo with applause, but with reflection. After decades spent under relentless lights, she now chooses stillness, presence, and the kind of intimacy that fame once stole from her. Her legacy is not tallied in trophies or headlines, but in lives she has touched, causes she has fueled, and the bonds she has struggled to repair. With her children, Vanessa Vadim and Troy Garrity, the connection, once fragile, has softened into something honest and enduring. Jane has never hidden the guilt of her absences when they were young, but she has refused to let regret write the last chapter. Instead, she has chosen to be present, choosing dinners filled with laughter, letters filled with tenderness, conversations filled with the patience and humility she once lacked. What binds them now is not perfection, but truth, not performance, but vulnerability. Fame demanded sacrifice. Motherhood now asks only sincerity. Romance, once a stage of compromise and pain, no longer dictates her story. After parting from Richard Perry in 2017, Jane embraced solitude not as loss, but as liberation. She has said simply, "I don't have time for it." Not with bitterness, but with peace. As if at last she understood that belonging to herself was the greatest love of all. For the first time in a lifetime of reinvention, she stands not as muse, comrade, or partner, but as her own. Yet perhaps the deepest closure did not come from children or lovers, but from the figure who haunted her earliest years, her father, Henry Fonda. For most of her life, he remained a towering yet unreachable shadow, adored by audiences but distant at home. Jane spent decades chasing his approval, often met with silence so sharp it felt like rejection. Then, in 1981, life and art converged. On the set of On Golden Pond, Jane played a daughter reaching for her father's affection. And in a moment unchoreographed by any script, Henry broke. He wept, not as an actor, but as a father finally seen. 5 months later, he was gone. But not before Jane whispered the words her 12-year-old self had yearned to speak. "I love you. I forgive you. I hope you forgive me." That exchange, fragile and fleeting, became her most sacred triumph. It did not glitter on a red carpet, nor was it etched on an Oscar. It lived in her heart. A daughter finally heard, a woman finally whole. And in that moment, long after the cameras stopped rolling, Jane Fonda found the redemption that decades of fame could never grant. The quiet peace of reconciliation, and the strength of a soul that had survived everything and still chosen love. Jane Fonda's financial legacy is as extraordinary as her life, measured not only in wealth, but in what that wealth represents. With an estimated net worth surpassing $200 million, she stands among Hollywood's most enduring women of success. Yet this fortune was never the product of inheritance or luck. It was sculpted from decades of discipline, reinvention, and fearless risk. From royalties on roles that still flicker across late-night screens, to the fitness tapes of the 1980s that sold over 17 million copies worldwide and redefined wellness culture, to investments chosen with conviction rather than vanity, Jane turned each reinvention into permanence. Her 10-year marriage to media mogul Ted Turner, ending in 2001 when she was 63, added an estimated $70 million to her independence. But even without it, her fortune was already her own, proof of resilience made tangible. Over the years, she has called many places home. A ranch in New Mexico sold for nearly $20 million. A Beverly Hills estate listed at $13 million. Each property a mirror of the chapter she was living. Ambition, retreat, reflection. Even her eclectic car collection, from vintage Cadillacs to quirky Volkswagens, speaks not of indulgence, but of identity, fragments of a woman forever in motion. Yet the truest measure of her wealth lies in how she's given it away. Through the Jane Fonda Foundation and decades of activism, she has funneled millions into women's rights, climate action, and youth programs, wielding her fortune not as a shield, but as a torch to light paths for others. But her fortune has always lived side by side with fragility. In 2010, at 72, she underwent a lumpectomy for breast cancer. In 2019, at 81, skin cancer appeared on her lip. And in 2022, at 84, came the heaviest blow, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She entered chemotherapy, not in secrecy, but openly, choosing to share her diagnosis so others might feel less alone. To the world, her courage looked unshakable. But Jane herself admitted the quiet hours were the hardest. The sterile hum of hospital machines, the weight of IV lines, the loneliness that arrives when night falls, and no applause is left to soften it. She once confessed, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of reaching the end with regrets." And regrets there were. Missed birthdays, hurried goodbyes, promises lost to a lifetime of causes and cameras. That guilt, she said, never vanished. It simply settled into her like a shadow she carried each morning. Still, she refused to surrender. She credits her endurance to discipline, light walks, even on weekdays, a Mediterranean diet, water always near, the grounding rituals of journaling and meditation. Even during chemo, she moved when she could. Her power has never come from denying age, but from embracing it. Now, At 87, Jane Fonda does not fight time. She honors it. Her silver hair, steady stance, and gaze clear with hard-won calm are not resistance, but reverence. In her presence, aging no longer looks like decline. It looks like proof of survival. Her cultural impact runs deeper than Oscars for Klute or Coming Home. She is admired not just for brilliance on screen, but for her courage to stand revealed, scarred, flawed, but unbroken. She transformed trauma into teaching, illness into empathy, aging into testimony. Her fortune may be vast, but her true inheritance to the world is not counted in millions. It is a story that tells anyone who has faltered, aged, or feared being forgotten. Your scars do not disqualify you. They define you. Jane Fonda's journey, fractured yet luminous, belongs not only to Hollywood, but to every person who has stumbled and chosen to rise. So I ask you, after walking through Jane Fonda's long road of reinvention and resilience, what part of her